data binding and few basics about data binding. We learned how to use the property and attribute binding. So technically, how we can bind the properties and attributes. Uh, One example I given you how we bind with attribute and how we bind with property and what is difference between attribute and property binding. So what is an attribute and what is a property? Two basic points also I given you. So here one important is, as already we discussed, that generally every every element related, every HTML actually, every HTML attribute, every HTML attribute is not having a relative. Every HTML attribute is not having a relative property, a relative property to handle dynamically. Dynamically. This is one problem we have to face. So we always prefer dynamic values to bind by using this property binding technique. In property binding technique, the properties are defined in square brace and we need to pass some dynamic value into it. Yesterday I showed you if you are using attribute binding, so it is not going to change the state of that value. Disabling the buttons, this not worked. That means the best preferred option is you go with property binding. The best preferred option is go with property binding. But problem is some attributes are not available as properties. Then we will face a problem. Some attributes are not having relative properties. That is one problem. I will show you such problem. For example, uh, suppose yesterday I showed you one HTML JavaScript page where we can read all the properties and values. These are all the properties and the code. This is the code I written for that. I just written a code for reading all properties from a table actually. So table have lot of properties. You can see these are all properties. Suppose I will write a logic here. So creating an element, I will open this and create element. I am creating some th table header actually. So we are referring to the variable called th and we are reading the property in th. Th is table header and we are printing the table header properties. And you can see these are all the table header properties, header related properties. And you can see that in the header properties, the property name is call span. That is the property name. Call span is the property name. When you write it, this S is not uppercase actually as attribute. When you write as attribute, call span is general, normal. It is general, normal, basic, lowercase only. But as a property, you have to write call span, yes, uppercase. And we have width and height and other options also available here. Suppose I want to apply, this is for table header. Observe carefully. This is call span. Yes is an uppercase one. Uppercase, that is property. Generally, when you write in HTML, usually we write simply like table call span is th or td, call span is equal to some 2 3, like this we will write. But this is attribute, not a property. If it is a property, you have to put it yes, and you have to keep in the square brace, and you can supply some dynamic value into it. So you have to use properties dynamically, not attributes. But unfortunately, sometimes what happens is, suppose we have table. So we are creating table element and defining the table element. Okay. Now I will refresh here. You can see these are table related attributes properties. In table related properties, I will search Control F, find. In the search box, I am searching for width. You can see width is available. Okay, I am searching for height. Directly height is not available. That means there is no height at all. You see 3 height options are searched here, and there is no just height property. There is no height property for table, but there is a height attribute for table. You see in the design, suppose I am creating a table. Just roughly at the top, I am creating a table. And in the table, I have some row. In that we have cell. So name, another cell. So price, like this. Just rough table. I will access this here. Localhost, and you can see the table is here. And for the table, I will keep some border. For table, I'm keeping border. Okay, is 1. And table has some border. Table is defined with the border here at the top. I want table height. I want a table width. I want table width to supply some dynamic value. Width should come from dynamic. Then what we will do is we will create here. So is property tab width, table width. Table width is some 300. Okay. And another property, table height. Table height is 100. Okay. So width and height are stored in this property. We can access these properties and apply. Dynamically you are applying. So we recommend in the square brace, one is width. And width I am defining, that is table width. Value is coming from this reference. And table we are giving height in the square brace, height. And it says that I don't have any height property. It says that cannot bind to height since it isn't a known property of table. But generally, as a HTML developer, we know that we can use height as an attribute and we can pass some height 100. You can see that height is passed with 100 and height is working there in the design. Height is working. Height is working, width is also working. But in the property, when I try to write like a property, because I need to supply some dynamic value, then it says that I don't have any height because I want to access from table height. Yeah, sorry, just some technical issue, connection disconnected, right? Yeah, it's fine. Let's continue. Uh, let's continue. Yeah, am I audible to everyone? Clear now? Right, fine. Okay, let's continue. See, good. So, yeah, so the basic, what is problem in property binding is some attributes that we use for HTML are not having relative properties to handle dynamically. Then in this case, what you have to do is you have to you have to use you have to use dynamic. So you have to use attribute as property binding. You have to use attribute as property binding with attr attr as prefix. So that means some HTML attributes are not available to handle dynamically. In that case, you have to use attribute as property binding with attr as prefix. That means this is not a property. That is why debugger says that I don't know any height property. I don't know any height property. And that is error also. Why? Because when the output you see, when we see the output here, you can observe that height is not applied, width is applied, height is not applied. I open the debugger, inspect element, and in the console, it is not showing any error here because this is not related to any logical compiling errors. It is just HTML. HTML issues are there. Now in this case, the point is the height is unable to apply because table height is actually set to 100. Now it is showing here in the compilation error since it says that height isn't a known property. That's okay. That means height is not a known property. But we know that height is an attribute and I want to apply a dynamic value to the attribute. So if directly to attribute you cannot apply. So directly to attribute you cannot apply. So when I define this table height directly, then you can see here still height is not applied. We have to keep this as a property, but it says that there is no property. Then we have to keep this with a prefix attr dot height. Now the problem is solved. That means Angular will allow to use any attribute dynamically by adding the prefix attr. Actually, internally, it uses attr, a special function which converts this into a dynamic value and uses as dynamic. Internally, it does that logic. So then it is good to define by using this technique if you are expecting a dynamic value into it. So then you cannot ask like, can I use attr for width also? You can use, but why to use? Not required. We don't need at all because we have a property by width. Better use that. That is more better and easy for a compiler to handle. Because when you are using attr, it has to use an additional function, and through that function it has to convert. We have to do that because we don't have any other chance. So that means if you are binding any dynamic value to an attribute, so then you can do that by using this technique. So then you can see that height is also working fine. height is working. So this situation comes several times because in HTML, several attributes are used for tags and all attributes are not available as properties. So in that case, we have to use an additional technique for using that dynamically. And for that, we need to use this ATTR. So what is the solution? Solution is you have to define the property. We have to define the property. Syntactically, we have to define in this way. Syntactically, we have to add in this way. So we have some element. So element. And in this, we have to use ATTR dot attribute name. Attribute name is equal to, so here reference. So dynamic reference. You have to use the dynamic reference. That is the basic syntax, how you configure. If it is available as a property, you can use it. And if it is not, then you have to configure this. So technically, when you are dealing with attributes and properties, many times people ask question like, sir, how do I know whether that property is available or not? There is no technique for that. So as experience, as growing in experience in development, once you are good in your JavaScript and HTML, then you will know because you are using them regularly. There is no blindfolded format like for this property is available, this not available. You have to write your own logic. You have to go through the metadata and observe whether the properties are available or not and use it. There is no any blindfolded technique to tell that this is available as a property, this is not available as a property. Just like I showed you, we can write a simple iterator to read all properties and see and verify. Other than that, there is no any blindfolded technique for this. So you need to know on experience, you need to know by exploring the properties and attributes about confirming whether it is available or not, right? So example is simple. What we have done is in the TS file. So in the TS file, .ts file, that means one-way demo. So one-way demo dot component dot ts. In this TS file, we are just adding, so these two properties, just roughly we are adding these two properties here. So we are adding those two properties there. So that is, one is table width, another one table height. And in the HTML file, we are dynamically applying to table. That means one-way demo dot component dot HTML. In HTML, we created some table where we are using this height and width options. In the table, roughly I configured those options. So in the table, we are doing it. And this is attribute binding. This is attribute. That means attribute is used as a property to bind any dynamic value by using the prefix ATTR. So if anyone asks which one you prefer, we always prefer property binding when dynamic values are coming. And if that attribute is not available as a property, then you have to go with ATTR. So and define it. So these are all the options, how we can bind with property, how we can bind with value, right? Technically, this all comes under the concept of one-way binding. So this is one-way binding. In a one-way binding, we can use interpolation, we can use property, we can use attribute. So technically, interpolation uses this flower brace, property binding uses the square brace, attribute binding will use ATTR, some name, and you can configure this. This is the basic about one-way binding. Now, how we can deal with two-way binding? So let's see two-way data binding. Two-way data binding. Actually, two-way data binding, technically, what is the concept of two-way data binding? So what is the intention of two-way data binding? In two-way data binding, the model data is bound with the view. The model data is bound with view. Changes in view will update the model. Changes in view will update the model. Model data is bound with view. Changes in view will update the model. That means model to view and vice versa. So the data will transfer model to view and vice versa. That means going from model to view and view to model, coming back again. So that is two-way binding. That means in this technique, model is referred as technically model is referred as single source of truth. Single source of truth. Model is referred as single source of truth. Why it is referred as single source of truth? Because it contains information which about the value, information about the value before and after change. That means before change what it contains, after change what it contains. Everything comes from a model only. So that means model contains information that tells what was the previous value and what is current value. Is previous value, current value same, or is there any change? If there is a change, then it identifies that, okay, some change occurred, then it updates the changes. Model changes are updated to view, view changes are updated to model. That is two-way technique. So currently you saw one-way technique. So in two-way data binding technique, actually, so model is considered as single source of truth. Actually, many technologies, client-side technologies especially, when they came into market, one of the major issue they were facing was data binding. Many client-side frameworks don't support two-way binding technique. So that was the major issue in the early days. So when the frameworks came client-side, one of the major advantages of becoming Angular as popular technology, growing popular. One is it belongs to Google. Another one is the support of two-way binding, which was very much required in regular applications. And due to that, actually before Angular JS and all, we were using Knockout JS, Backbone JS. Even today we use Knockout and Backbone JS. But they have limitations with two-way binding. Angular JS provides a clean architecture of two-way binding. That is the reason we shifted to two-way binding technique. So, and it supports it. And this is what actually two-way binding is. So that means two-way data binding. This is what actually two-way data binding. In two-way data binding, so what happens is the data from the model, in two-way binding, the data from the model. So the data from the model is sent to the view. And any change in the view is updated back to the model. That means it continuous updates are present in the model. So model is single source of truth. That is a technical term. Why it is called single source of truth? Because model is the source which keeps tracking the information. So before change and after change. That means it knows what is there previous and what is there after the change, before change and after change. That is why technically it is called single source of truth. So here, this is a continuous technique, and this is good. So how this two-way binding works, how we can implement two-way binding. And to implement two-way binding, to deal with the two-way binding, we need a model. And before understanding two-way binding, you need to understand one more concept actually. I will tell you. So you cannot directly understand two-way binding. To understand two-way binding, you need to know one more point. Then you can get a clarity on two-way binding. Means how this two-way binding works actually. So this is the basic. Yeah. So this is the two-way binding. So this is the two-way binding. Yeah. Actually, the concept about two-way binding is main point you understood. That means it is responsible for updating the changes, tracking the changes and updating the changes. Here the key point is how this actually works in the background. In order to implement this two-way binding, we need to know some more concepts like, see, what happens is generally, suppose we have a text box. Technically, we are having a text box. Okay. Now, in the text box, some username. Okay. In the text box, we need to display some value. Suppose we are having a property. So public, some username is equal to some John. Okay. This value we need to show inside the text box. Then in order to show the value in the text box, which technique we use? Can you tell me which technique we use? Just now we discussed which technique we use to display the value in the option. I told you which technique is used to attach that value. Okay, data binding technique only. In this, which one is best? Dynamically you are applying a value. Which one is best? Property binding is best, na? Am I right? Right. So property binding. That means the value is, that means what is the value here we are having? So what is the value here? So actually we are having a value property. To the value property, we will attach this username. That means through property binding. Okay, good. Now very important is, whenever we make some changes, that means here John is there. Whenever we make the changes 1, 2, 3, how this property gets notified about the changes? Generally, when it is get notified about the changes, generally if you are using JavaScript or jQuery, tell me when you can tell that change happened. What you use to tell that change happened? In general JavaScript or jQuery, when you will tell that the change happened in that value, how you will tell that change happened? Good. We use event, na? Event. Am I right? Yeah, good. We use event. We can use any event, on blur, on key press, on change. We can use any event. The concept is event, na? Am I right? Yeah. So that means event is used to notify the change and update the change back to the property. And in Angular, events are binded like this, like click. This is an event. On the event, it can call a function. It can call a function and it can execute that functionality. It can call a function. You can use it in the round brace. We have to use on like key press, and we need to call a function. That is how generally we use event. Generally we use event in Angular. Later in Angular, I will discuss about event binding separate. We will discuss about event binding in a separate concept. Later we will see that event binding, how it works and all. But events are defined in this way. I will show you here in our example. Suppose I will write a function. I will write a method public alert show alert. Okay. And it is having an alert. So here in the alert, welcome to Angular, that message I am giving. Okay. Now this function, this method should be called when I click a button. So above, I will just add a button, show alert. Okay. On this button click, I need to call that. You can see there is a button above. There is a button above. Show alert is a button above. And I need to display. I will keep that button somewhere here. Okay, before that submit. Fine. So we have a button. Show alert is a button. So there is a show alert button. On button click, I want that function to call. Then we use event as click. Click. Click is event which is calling show alert method. We are calling that show alert method. Then what happens is when I click on show alert, then automatically it shows an alert. Welcome to Angular. You saw how event is working. Means event is binded. Actually, event is binded in this brace. Event binding. That means now what you understood by this concept is you need two options for two-way binding. What are the two options for two-way binding? Tell me. You need two options for two-way binding. What are the two options? What are the two options? Property binding and event binding. Am I right? That means for two-way binding, you need property binding and event binding. Why you need property binding? Why you need property binding? To display the value. Good. Why we need event binding? Why we need event binding? To update the changes in the value. Am I right? To update the changes in the value, we need event binding. To display the value, yeah, good. To capture the changes we need. Okay. Now, who is having the value in MVC framework? Who is having the value in MVC framework? Who is having the value in MVC framework? Model. Good. Model is having the value now, right? Model is having the value in MVC framework. That means now model have to use. So model in Angular we can access by using ng model. The model is accessed. Model is defined by using ng model. ng model will configure a model for your control. It will configure a model for your control. And this ng model should use property binding and event binding. Model should use property and event binding. Am I right? Model should use property and event binding. Am I right? Model should use both property and event binding. So to update the changes and display. Then generally, how we define that? How we define that is we write this like this. In the square brace, we write a parenthesis and we write ng model. Ng model. We write ng model. Understood? We write ng model. Understood? That means what is the first step happening here? What is the outer one? First one. It is getting the value. So that means you can see ng model is equal to some username. Understood? Ng model is equal to some username. I defined like this. Is equal to username. Now at the outer level, first it is having property binding. Am I right? At the outer level, it is having property binding. That means what it will do is it will pick up this value and it will bind to the property of that element. It will bind the value and it will apply to the property. Suppose I am writing this in this way. Suppose I am writing this in this way. That means input type is equal to text. And ng model, so is equal to username. Now, this username is attached to a property. To which property it will attach that username? Default property where it can show the value. That means to which property it will apply? So it will apply to the property called value. That means to the value property, yes, to the value property, it is attaching. That means that username attached to value. Okay. Whenever you make change in the value, that means you are changing. A change event will fire up. Understood? A change event will fire up. That change event is going to update the value into this username. Understood? That change event is going to update the value into that. Is going to update that. I hope everyone understood. That means model is responsible for handling two things. One is one-way binding, property binding and attribute binding. Property and attribute binding. What is actually ng model? Technically, we call ng model as a directive. ng model is a directive. So technically, what is the purpose of this directive? The purpose of this directive is it is responsible for extending HTML element and making it dynamic. It extends the HTML element and makes it dynamic. ng model is a directive. Technically, ng model is a directive. This directive is used with your element. Very important is this ng model is going to use the default properties, that is value, the default event, that is change. So by using those property and event binding, it will get the values and update the changes. So that means you need a special directive to handle this, that is ng model. And ng model is a directive which is present in forms module. And forms module is present in a library, that is Angular/forms. So you cannot use ng model directly. In order to use ng model, technically in order to use ng model, you need to first import forms module into your application. And forms module will provide ng model. If you directly try to use that ng model with any element, you try to use that ng model. That means property binding and attribute binding, ng model, it's not available. You cannot use this. There is no ng model. It says that cannot bind to ng model since it is not a property of input. So this ng model is not ready. We cannot use it. We cannot use that. In order to use that, first we need to import. We have to import this forms module into project. And forms module comes from Angular Forms library. Then you can use this ng model. So let's do all the work now. So that means we are going to handle. So we are going to handle, and where you can import that option also we know. Right. Yeah, we can use any custom event also. That's what we will learn in event binding. By default, it is using the default event. Now remember, it will use an MVVM architecture here. That means model to view, view to model. If you are implementing an MVC architecture, that means controller, then you can write your own event and you can update on that particular event. Understood? We can use our own event and update on that particular event, right? So initially, now see here, I will create a simple first point. In order to use model, what we need to do, go to app module.ts. In app module, you have to first import a module. Import module from Angular @Angular/forms. From Angular Forms, you have to import a module called forms module. Forms module. Okay. After importing the forms module in app module, because app module is the location where we have to register all our modules, and the modules are registered in imports. Components are registered in declarations. Components are registered in declarations, and modules are in imports. That means here we have to define forms module. Okay. Now the forms module is ready, and it will give you access to ng model. Okay, let's design one example. So this is the first step, what we have to do to implement. And who is responsible for handling? So ng model is a directive, responsible for handling two-way binding is responsible for handling two-way binding. So it uses actually technically, so it uses property and event binding technique. Property binding is used. Property binding is used to bind the model value. And event binding is used to update the changes. And square brace, so it defines, so square brace defines property binding. And round brace, this defines event binding. And ng model uses square brace and parenthesis ng model. So this refers to two-way binding. It refers to two-way binding. That's how we need to configure. So Many people give many definitions, right? So when you go online, several suggestions will come related to this square brace, round brace. So everyone have his own story about this, right? But technically, why they are written like that as per the Angular standards? So why it is written like this? So we need to note why it is written in this way. What is the intention of writing this square brace and all? So the main intention is to tell that it is handling the property and event binding concepts, right? Handling model is handling both implicitly. It is handling both implicitly, right? That is the intention here. So implicitly means it is considering a property by itself and binding it. It is considering an event by itself and using it. So it is not asking you which property and which event to use. It will take care about everything implicitly. That's what actually the point is. And important, ng model is a member of forms module, is a member of forms module present in at the net angular slash forms library. Okay, so we need to first implement all this, then we can start working with this. So already we implemented that, that means we imported that. Okay, let's create one example now. I will create a component. So two-way binding. So ng generate component two-way binding. Okay, two-way binding and skip test. Okay, so I am generating a component called two-way binding and keep this two-way binding component in the startup. We will start with the two-way binding just to understand how this actually works. Okay, so let's go and keep this two-way binding component. Okay, that is the name I given, right? Two-way binding. Let's go and see the reference selector name. Two-way binding. Yeah, not component here. So this is two-way binding. Yeah, fine. Okay, now in the HTML, in the index, we will keep the two-way binding. Two-way binding. Okay, I keep this in the startup. Obviously, now it is starting with our two-way binding. Fine. Let's create one simple design here. In the two-way binding, I'm creating a simple UI. I will keep a div and class as container fluid. Okay, that is just a bootstrap class. And here I keep a heading. So products are two-way binding. Okay, just a header. And let's keep a class as text center and text primary. Okay. And below this, I will keep a div. In that we have a class as a row. In that two divs will be there. One is call3 and 3 columns, and another div we have a class as call9. Yeah, because total width of columns will be 12 actually. Okay, in this left column, I'm designing a div. We are creating a simple form. Class is equal to form group. In that we have a label, so name. And we are defining a div, a text box. Input type is equal to text and class is equal to form control. Okay. So that is one form group with a label and a text box. This is for name. Okay, fine. Another div. So we have a class form group, another form group, and here we are using a label. And I'm defining, just for our understanding sake, I will keep various options. I will keep here as a select city, or say shipped to, shipped to, shipped to. I will keep a drop down here. So that means I will keep a select, and the class is form control. And usually the drop down contains an option. So like Delhi, so an option like Hyderabad. Okay, like this. So that is another group. Just to make you understand about different controls. So here I'm using another class form group, and here I am defining label is in stock. And for that, I will keep a checkbox. Input type is equal to checkbox. Is in stock. So here I say yes. Checkbox is having it. Okay, now you can see that the form that you have designed. So it looks in this way. So left side, you have option for a name. We have option for this is for name, and this is for shipped to, and this is for stock. Right. So wherever we have label, I will go to the CSS here actually. In the CSS, wherever we have label, for label, I give font weight as bold. So wherever we have label, let's keep this font weight as bold. So that means label will be bold. We have name, we have shipped to, and we have is in stock. Now we need to display the details right side in the right table. This is the right column. In the right column, I am creating a table. Table will have a class called table and table hover. So I am using a table. In the table, we have a row directly. In that, we have a cell. This is having a name, and beside it empty. Another table row. So this is for that is shipped to, and the cell beside it is empty. Okay. Another row. This is for in stock stock status, and here we use table cell empty. We have a table to display the data. We are using some table here. So name, shipped to, stock status, we are defining this. And here I will just use a call group, and span is equal to 1, and style for that call group. So font weight as bold. So that means that column group will keep left column, and some background color we will give here. It is not having text actually. So I will keep a background color. Background color, some light color, some aquam, and it will get the column group and display here like this. This is the name, shipped to, stock status. That's just a column we are adding. Now our intention is whatever the values user is typing here, we need to get the values and display the values beside this. That means we need to get the values and display them. Any changes should update there. So what we are doing now is we are going to two-way binding TS file. Here we are creating some properties for storing the details, of name. So public and name. Name is equal to, I will bind this. So this is some Samsung TV, something like this. Okay, that's a string, some value. Another one is in city. City is some Delhi. Okay, that is having a value. And public, another one in stock is a Boolean value, true. True. That means this is a string. These two are string, and this. I need to bind these three properties with these three controls we are having. That means the name should be binded. The name should be binded. So the name should be binded. The name should be binded with the name property. Name should be binded with the name property. Then it should support two-way binding. Then we are using here ng model, and it should bind with name. That's it. It is binding with the name. Drop down, this select is a drop down. It should bind with two-way binding, ng model. It should bind with city. Bind with city. And stock, it is a checkbox. It is using ng model. Usually checkbox use boolean, true, false. And checkbox should bind with in stock. And you can see that those values are binded to this particular controls. You can see here Samsung TV, Delhi, and in stock is checked by default. Yes is there. Now those values I need to display in the right column. Then here beside name I can bind. How to bind in table cell? We can use inner HTML. Inner HTML is equal to, I will bind name. We can also use interpolation. Directly we can use this. This is only showing, you can show in any way. I'm using all the method. So here I'm using some city. And here I am displaying an expression. Here we can write an expression because in stock is returning a boolean true or false. Then I will write a ternary operator. If in stock is equal to true, if in stock is equal to true, question mark, I will print as available, and colon, otherwise I will print as out of stock. These details we will print here. That means we are writing a simple ternary operator here. If the condition true, then it will print available, otherwise it will be false. So now you can see that now table contains the data here. So it should display the data here. It gets the data and show. That means Samsung TV, Delhi, and its stock status is available. Now what I am doing here in this, what I am doing is just we are making changes into this. That means we are making changes into this. So that means what we are doing here is we are making changes in the product name. That means I said mobile. You can see it is updated here automatically. And we are not writing any event. By default, an event is working. I changed here Hyderabad. It changed that Hyderabad. I am changing the checkbox in stock. I removed, it says out of stock. And I selected yes, then it says available. That means you are changing this, automatically it will get that and it will display. So that means dynamically it is accessing the value and it is using the value. Whatever the changes you are doing, it is displaying it. That means this is just label. These are just table cells. In table cells, we don't want to allow any modification. In that only displaying, you display any way you want. You can display through property binding. You can display through attribute binding, because from here you are not making change. We are making change from the text boxes and drop downs that are using two-way binding here. We are using ng model. Gets the value and binds the value. Any change in the value, it will update back to that by using an event binding technique. That is what actually the two-way binding here. Now in this point, I don't want to update immediately. I want to update only when I need it. That means after entering the values, user will once check them and submits them. Then we need to collect and update. That means we need a controller which will handle the communication. Now observe, in this communication, directly model is updating to view, and any changes in the view are updating back to the model. And we need explicitly a controller to come to picture. And controller should able to handle the interaction. It should not update immediately. That means I will design that later. We will see that later. We need to keep a button. And when user clicks the button update, then these details should be updated. I don't want immediate. How you manage custom events, that we will see later, how we can manage that events. But this is just a simple example of two-way binding. So we are accessing the data and binding here. And any change in that, it is reverting back and it is updating back into this model. That is what happens in two-way. And to handle this two-way binding, you need this ng model. And why it is written in square brace and parenthesis, that we already discussed about that. So here we are not writing much logic at all. If I have to implement the same in jQuery or JavaScript, lot of DOM manipulations, lot of events are required. Here simple, we are just utilizing the concept of MVC framework. We are using the directives and we are binding and handling them. That is one simple point to understand. So if we know this now, we can go complex and design more complex examples to understand the complete process. We will see some real world examples, how they are designed and used through these techniques, that we will see in our next session, right? So next session, is it possible for you to tomorrow session, tomorrow session means very early we will conduct the session, morning 7 a.m. okay? Morning 7 a.m. okay, everyone? Tomorrow morning 7 a.m. Acha, you have some other batches, huh? 9 a.m. I have another batch, right? Okay. Because the problem here is some people are attending our sessions from abroad. Due to that, timing issue will come, right? Some people are attending from abroad, so issues are there. Because I just want a evening time, Sunday evening time, it is not great to spend evening, Sunday evening with you. Am I right? Huh? Right? I don't think so.